In 323 BC, Alexander the Great would die. The Hellenistic world would soon collapse into chaos, as his former generals and officials would divide his empire, and subsequently descend into what would become the Wars of the Diadochi. In 297 BC, Ptolemy I of Egypt, in an attempt to regain influence on the Macedonian heartland, would agree to sponsor an expedition to help Pyrrhus regain the throne of Epirus, which he had previously held from 307 to 302. Providing him with an army, Pyrrhus would retake his kingdom. In 288 BC, Pyrrhus and Lysimachus would launch a joint invasion of Macedon, forcing Demetrius to abandon it, though Lysimachus would soon turn on him, forcing him to withdraw back to Epirus. In 281 BC, Lysimachus would be defeated in the Battle of Corupendum. As Seleucus moved to take control of his European possessions, he would be assassinated by Ptolemy Ceraunus, who would seize control of the European territories for himself. Pyrrhus would use this opportunity to form an alliance with the new Macedonian king, for now securing his eastern border. To the west, in Italy, a new power was rapidly expanding. As a result of the Samnite Wars, the Roman Republic now controlled the majority of central Italy. In the south, the peninsula was made up of various Italian tribes, as well as a large number of independent Greek city-states. One of the most powerful of these states was Tarentum, and by the beginning of the 3rd century BC, Rome's increasing power began to frighten the city's elite. Tarentum largely possessed mastery of the sea and control over the Greek colonies in Magna Graecia. Though after the surrender of the Samnites in 290 BC, the Romans founded many colonies in Apulia and Lucania. Furthermore, some of the city-states in Magna Graecia asked Rome for military support, as well as Roman garrisons. In Tarentum, 2 political parties were present. The Democrats, led by Philocharis and Inesus, were dominant. They were decisively against Roman influence, as they knew that if the Romans entered Tarentum, the Greeks would lose their independence. The second faction were the aristocrats, led by Agis. They had lost their power when Tarentum became a democracy, and did not oppose surrendering to Rome, as would increase their own influence in the city. However, the aristocrats did not want to openly surrender to Rome and become unpopular with the population. In 282 BC, Rome sent a fleet under Admiral Lucius Valerius, carrying troops to garrison Thurii. The 10 ships arrived in the Gulf of Tarentum during a holy day, which greatly angered the Tarentines, who considered it a hostile act, openly in conflict with the treaty they had previously made with Rome, which forbade Roman ships from entering the Gulf of Tarentum. The Tarentine navy now responded by attacking the Roman fleet, sinking 4 Roman ships and capturing a 5th. The army and fleet of Tarentum now moved to Thurii and exiled the aristocrats, helping reinstate their fellow Democrats. Once Rome received news of the attack on their ships, they sent envoys to demand the return of their prisoners and the surrender of the perpetrators. The envoys were presented to the people, who subsequently mocked them and rejected their proposal. When the envoys returned to Rome, there was great indignation. In the years of 283 and 282 BC, Rome had seen victories over an Etruscan-Gallic alliance. Rome had also seen revolts in the south by the Lucanians, Bruttians, and Samnites, all of which had been subjugated after the Third Samnite War, but still remained semi-independent. The Romans, so outraged by the Tarentines, would order Lucius Aemilius Barbula to suspend his operations against the rebellious Samnites and march south against Tarentum. By the summer of 281 BC, Barbula's contingent would begin marching south, plundering the region as they went. His first goal was to recapture Thurii, depriving the Tarentines of a key ally, and giving his own army a base of operations next to the Tarentine borderland. Once the Roman army arrived, the siege was quick. The city soon surrendered and allowed the Romans to reinstate the pro-Roman aristocrats. Barbula now aimed to take action directly against Tarentum and began marching his army east. Tarentum began mustering their own army, aiming to meet the Romans in the field. The Tarentine force was also bolstered by troops from both the Samnites and Lucanians. The two armies met just to the west of Tarentum itself. The battle was quick, as the Roman army would win a decisive victory, crushing the Greek forces. What was left of the Tarentine force would retreat back into the city. Barbula's force would begin to plunder the countryside around Tarentum, though without naval supremacy and lacking proper siege equipment, the army would be unable to completely siege the city. The political state of the city was once again divided. A large contingent led by Agis aimed to negotiate terms with the Romans, while the Democrats still opposed peace and wanted to seek an alliance with Pyrrhus. Eventually, the people agreed on an alliance with Pyrrhus and sent him a formidable offer. Tarentum promised him full military backing, a fleet to transport his army to Italy, and the Samnites, Lucanians, and Bruttians would join his cause, providing him with tens of thousands of soldiers. Pyrrhus was also to be named supreme commander of the allied force, and was told there was great possibility for building a kingdom both in southern Italy and Sicily. Pyrrhus would decide to help Tarentum, as he believed he could count on help from the various southern Italian tribes, all peoples with a long history of conflict with Rome. Though he would have to secure his position in Epirus before he left, Pyrrhus formed an alliance and borrowed soldiers and money from Ptolemy Ceraunus. His longtime friend and ally, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, the king of Ptolemaic Egypt, also promised to send him 9,000 soldiers to hold Epirus in his absence, with the condition they would only serve him for 2 years. In return, Pyrrhus named him protector of Epirus in his absence. Pyrrhus first sent a force of 3,000 Epirot soldiers under the command of Milan to secure and prepare the city for the arrival of his main army. Though in Tarentum, the people had realized their inability to defeat Rome without external support, and decided to negotiate a temporary truce with Barbula under the leadership of Agis. This had allowed Barbula to break the siege and marched north to deal with the rebelling Samnites. Though now with the arrival of the Epirot troops, the Tarentine spirit for war was reinvigorated, and they quickly broke off their peace talks with Rome. Once the Tarentine ships arrived, Pyrrhus set sail with his main army for Italy. Though soon after setting sail, the navy would run into a violent storm, causing several ships to be blown off course. Nevertheless, the Epirot army would land mostly intact in the port of Tarentum. Pyrrhus soon saw that the majority of Tarentum was incapable, and were inclined to let him do their fighting for them, while they remained at home in the enjoyment of their baths and social festivities. He closed up the gymnasia and the public walks, and enrolled the vast majority of them for military service. While Pyrrhus was securing his control of Tarentum, the Romans had replaced their consuls. Tiberius Coruncanius had taken control of the northern army in Etruria, and Publius Valerius Laevinus was in command of the southern army near Samnium. Pyrrhus soon received word that Laevinus was marching his army south, heading towards Heraclea. Pyrrhus would initially wait to engage the Romans until he had received reinforcements from the allied tribes, though it soon became apparent to him that the reinforcements were delayed. Pyrrhus would decide to fight the Romans on a plain surrounding the river Cirrus. Before the fight, he sent diplomats to the Roman consul, promising that he could arbitrate the conflict between the Romans and the population of southern Italy. He asserted that his allies recognized him as judge and demanded the same recognition from the Romans. Laevinus answered that the Romans neither chose Pyrrhus as a mediator nor feared him as a foe. They entered the plain on opposite sides of the Cirrus River, where they set up camp. When Pyrrhus learned that the Romans were encamped on the opposite side of the Cirrus River, he rode up to the bank to get a view of them. And when he had observed their discipline, the appointment of their watches, their order, and the general arrangement of their camp, he was amazed, and said to the friend nearest him, "The discipline of these barbarians is not barbarous, but the result will show us what it amounts to." He was now less confident of the battle, and determined that he should wait for his reinforcements. He positioned a guard of skirmishers and light infantry on the bank of the river to check the Romans if they attempted to cross. Though the Romans, once they heard of the reinforcements which were coming to Pyrrhus, decided that it was better to attempt to cross the river and defeat Pyrrhus while his force was still divided. The Roman force formed up in their standard triplex acies formation, with the hastati in the front line, the principals forming the second line, and the experienced triarii forming the third line. On the wings, the Romans deployed their cavalry. As the Romans advanced across the river, the light infantry from both sides began to skirmish. Though Pyrrhus's skirmishers were greatly outmatched, as they had only been expected to slow down the Roman advance and give the Epirites a warning. Once Pyrrhus received news the Romans were advancing, he quickly began forming his men into battle lines, working to form his formidable Macedonian phalanx, and forming his Thessalian and Greek cavalry on both wings, with a reserve of elephants placed at the rear. Though before his phalanx was fully prepared, he received news the Roman cavalry had managed to cross the river at several points, forcing his skirmishers to retreat back to his lines. Pyrrhus now hoped to delay the Roman army and buy time for his forces to finish forming up. He would lead 3,000 horsemen in a counterattack, hoping to attack the Romans while they were still crossing the river and find them scattered and disordered. But when he came to the crossing point, he saw a multitude of shields gleaming on the riverbank, and the Roman cavalry advancing on him in good order. Realizing the Romans were well prepared for an attack, he instead aimed to target their weakest point, the Roman cavalry on the flanks, which, although good, were no match for the Greek cavalry, which was both more experienced and the best of its kind. Pyrrhus formed his men into a tight formation before leading them in this attack on the Roman flanks. Pyrrhus, as he fought with his men, was easily conspicuous for the beauty and splendor of his richly ornamented armor. At one point, Pyrrhus's horse was killed beneath him, and Pyrrhus, realizing he had to be more careful, would switch his cloak and armor with Megacles, one of his companions. Pyrrhus would then call up his phalanx, and after taking up position behind the formation, would charge the Roman line. For a long time, the battle remained undecided. Both the Roman legions and the Macedonian phalanx stood in stalemate. Though on the right flank, Megacles, who wore the king's armor, was slain. The Romans, believing they had killed Pyrrhus, took his helmet and began riding up and down the line, displaying it. The Romans at once gained the upper hand and began to push the Epirates back, as they now believed their king was dead. Pyrrhus, trying to reinvigorate his men, rode along the line without a helmet to show them he was still alive. After stabilizing his battle line, he realized this was a crucial point in the battle, and now deployed his elephants. He used the majority of them to support his infantry thrust in the center. The Romans had never seen such beasts, and were completely unprepared to deal with them. In the center, the elephants began to disorganize, put the Roman infantry in a frantic state. Pyrrhus also deployed some to the wings of his formation. Once the Roman cavalry saw the beasts, their horses immediately bolted, running away with their riders. Once the flanks broke, the disorganized Roman infantry now broke as well, retreating across the river. The victory was utterly decisive, though it had cost Pyrrhus some of his most experienced men and many of his best officers. Laevinus would gather up the remnants of his army and quickly set off for Apulia. Pyrrhus had already gained the support of the Samnites, Lucanians, and Bruttians, and he feared following the battle, more Roman cities were likely to defect to the Epirate king. Pyrrhus's force would remain encamped near Heraclea. He was still awaiting the arrival of the allied tribes which were yet to join him. This both frustrated him and made him proud that he had beat the Romans with only his core Epirates. While he was waiting, Pyrrhus began surveying the situation. He had received news that several southern Greek cities were joining him. He had hoped both Campania and Apulia would also revolt, though Laevinus's quick action had meant Apulia was now firmly garrisoned with Roman troops, making a revolt nearly impossible. Pyrrhus thought that to win the war, he would have to march on Rome itself, forcing him to move through the heavily garrisoned towns of Campania, which he thought would be both costly and slow. Instead, he favored peace with Rome. He had achieved his aim of halting any direct threat to Tarentum, and had received both honor and prestige from his great victory. Pyrrhus would send Cineas to Rome with peace terms. He asked that the Romans recognize the independence of his Greek allies, and refrain from interfering in the affairs of Magna Graecia. In return, he promised to release all Roman captives, and arbitrate any future disputes they might have. When Cineas presented these before the Roman Senate, they were initially willing to accept the terms, though following a speech from Appius Claudius Caecus, a former consul, who deeply denounced any negotiations with the foreign invader, the Senate rallied around him, and soon demanded that Pyrrhus must leave Italy before they would resume their talks of peace. To Pyrrhus, this was unreasonable, and he soon began preparing his army, which was now bolstered by a large contingent of Italian tribesmen. His first aim was Campania. If he could wrestle it from the Romans, the door to Rome itself would be open. Laevinus, once he received news on his enemy's movements, would quickly rush his army west. Before Pyrrhus arrived, he was able to bolster the garrisons of the Campanian cities, making a quick siege impossible. Once Pyrrhus realized this, he would resort to raiding the countryside, hoping to force the cities into surrender by sheer intimidation. Though it soon became apparent the arrival of Laevinus's army had hardened their resolve, and not wanting to get tied down into a protracted siege, he instead aimed to bypass the cities and march on Rome directly. His army would advance as far north as Praeneste, roughly 23 miles, or 37 kilometers from Rome, before his scouts would bring him grave news. Since Rome had been sacked by Brennus's Gauls in 390 BC, the walls and garrison of Rome had been improved, and would not fall without a prolonged siege. Worse yet, Rome had made peace with the Etruscans, freeing up Coruncanius and the Second Roman Legion, which had been stationed in Etruria to march south against Pyrrhus. If he stayed, he would be trapped between 3 Roman armies. He would soon turn his force around and march back through Campania, where he would head to winter quarters in Tarentum. Over the winter, both sides knew a battle was imminent. The Romans took time to recruit new soldiers to replace those that had been killed the previous year. They also replaced their consuls. Publius Decius Mus took over the northern army, while Publius Salvero replaced Laevinus. In Tarentum, Pyrrhus did not have the luxury of a vast manpower pool like the Romans. His most prominent force, the Phalangites, were made up mostly of Epirates, with Macedonians and some Greek mercenaries supplementing their ranks, though as they were in Italy, these men were hard to replenish. He managed to recruit some Italian Greeks, but for the most part this would be a severe problem that would impact his entire Italian campaign. By the time spring broke, the 2 armies were eager. Counter to what he had done the previous year, Pyrrhus instead aimed to attack Apulia. Though he likely knew that, similar to Campania, the cities had been reinforced with Roman garrisons and would not surrender easily. It was more likely just a ruse to get the Roman armies to attack him on his own terms. His main force would take up position just south of Asculum, along the Aphidus River. The Romans likewise would march to meet him with both consular armies. On a warm summer day in 279 BC, the 2 armies would form up for battle. Just as they had at Heraclea, both armies were deployed on opposite sides of the river. The Romans deployed their standard triplex Achaeas formation. Their infantry contingent numbered roughly 40,000 men, with 16,000 of these being Roman legionaries, while the other 24 were made up of various allied troops. On the flanks, the Romans deployed roughly 5,000 cavalry, splitting them between the 2 flanks. The Romans also deployed roughly 300 anti-elephant wagons, armed with iron spikes, spears, missile troops, and incendiary devices. On the other side, Pyrrhus deployed his infantry in the center, with roughly 38,000 men. His elite Phalangites were placed on the right, with his Greek mercenaries and Epirate tribesmen in the center, and the Samnites, Lucanians, and Bruttians on the left flank. He matched the Romans with roughly 5,000 cavalry on his flanks, and preserved an elite 2,000-strong cavalry force in reserve behind the line, with his 19 war elephants and skirmishers positioned behind them. Pyrrhus's deployment was initially along the riverbank, though he soon realized that the uneven ground made it harder on his phalanx, and after a short exchange with the Romans, agreed to pull back from the river to flatter ground in his rear and allow the Romans to fully cross before engaging them. Pyrrhus hoped to use his infantry to hold the Romans in place, while his better cavalry could win on the flanks and then envelop the Roman center. On the contrary, the Romans aimed for a decisive infantry breakthrough. They hoped they could win this on the right flank, where Pyrrhus had positioned his Italian allies, which were incredibly good at fighting on broken ground, but lacked the discipline of the Roman troops. With both sides now reformed, they would begin advancing. Pyrrhus's force was still hampered by the broken ground, which was better than by the river, but still hindered his phalanx. As the formations closed, the Epirot phalanx, wielding their long 18-foot sarissa spears, kept the Romans at range, who formed tight shield walls and attempted to push and disorder the phalanx. On the Roman right, their troops smashed into the contingent of Italian tribesmen. On the flanks, the Epirot cavalry charged repeatedly. After delivering their blow, they would wheel around to charge again in the Macedonian style. As the day progressed, it soon became apparent the Roman right had gained the upper hand. Their disciplined formation began pushing the tribesmen back, and Pyrrhus's cavalry on the flanks had failed to make any decisive break. At this moment, the Greek troops in the center began to falter, and the Romans made several decisive breakthroughs. Pyrrhus, realizing the time to act was now, committed his full cavalry reserve to the center. His elite horsemen smashed into the tired Roman infantry, at once pushing them back and stabilizing his center. Pyrrhus now called up his elephants, aiming to smash the weakened enemy line. The Romans, deploying their own anti-elephant forces, hoped to halt the beasts before they could fully disrupt their infantry. The carts were initially successful, halting the elephants' advance, though the light infantry deployed alongside them began picking off the soldiers manning the carts, and before long what was left of the corps was forced to retreat. The elephants began to run rampant along the Roman lines, disordering and scattering the Roman infantry. Soon any hope of maintaining their formation was lost, and they were forced to give ground. On the flank, a lone Roman contingent managed to break through the Epirot lines and headed for their camp, subsequently setting it on fire. Though in the end it was all for naught, as the Pyrrhot cavalry and elephants had decisively won on the Roman right flank, and fearing the prospect of being encircled, the Romans were forced to withdraw from the field. Unlike Heraclea, they managed to keep good order and conducted a well-organized retreat. The Pyrrhic forces, seeing this and being exhausted from the battle themselves, did not give chase. As Pyrrhus looked out onto the battlefield, he is quoted to have said, "If we are victorious in one more battle with the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined." The Pyrrhic losses numbered roughly 3,500, while the Romans lost 6,000. The battle would result in the first of Pyrrhus's Pyrrhic victories. He had won a stunning battle, but the cost was immense. Unlike the Roman troops, Pyrrhus's men were not easily replaceable. and as he had seen at the end of the First War, Rome would not surrender, no matter the gravity of their defeat. As the two Roman armies retreated back to Latium, Pyrrhus was left with a decision. He could either continue campaigning against an enemy that would not surrender, or he could pursue other options. He had received offers from both Sicily and Macedon to become their kings. Ptolemy Keranos had been killed in the Gallic invasion of Macedon, and his realm was now kingless, and had invited Pyrrhus. While Sicily was being invaded by the Carthaginians, who had several key strongholds to the west of the island, and were currently besieging Syracuse. Pyrrhus was left with little prospect of making further gains in Italy. He had received the surrender of some Apulian cities, but for the most part was unable to make further progress against Rome. For Pyrrhus, the idea of assisting Sicily was more promising. He had long envisioned making a kingdom to the west, as Alexander had done in the east, and control over Sicily was a great strategic ground to launch an invasion of Africa and expand naval power across the western Mediterranean. To the horror of his various Greek and Italian allies, he would send word to the Sicilians that he accepted their proposal. He would withdraw back to Tarentum, where he would leave a sizable garrison force under the command of Milan, before setting sail for Sicily. The Carthaginians for the most part had a blockade of the island, though Pyrrhus's army was able to slip past it undeterred. He would initially sail to Tauromenium, where he would receive provisions and reinforcements. From there he sailed to Catania, before he would begin marching to Syracuse. The Carthaginian army which was besieging the city was taken by complete surprise, as they quickly abandoned their operations. When Pyrrhus entered the city, he was proclaimed as a liberator, and quickly crowned the king of Syracuse, receiving their full military support. His navy, which could now be combined with that of the city, decisively outnumbered the Punic forces, forcing them to abandon their blockade of the island. Pyrrhus now continued along the southern coast of the island, receiving support and funds from the various Sicilian cities. When he came to Agrigentum, he would encamp his force for winter. The Carthaginian force on the island, which was led by Hamilcar, would winter in Lilybaeum, the largest and most formidable of the Carthaginian fortresses in Sicily. Pyrrhus knew this and aimed to capture the other Carthaginian cities first, hopefully isolating the city. As the campaigning season of 278 BC began, Pyrrhus would continue along the southern coast of Sicily. The first city of Heraclea Minoa would fall shortly after a successful assault of the city. Pushing west in the Carthaginian territory, he would receive the surrender of both Selinus and Segesta. His next major target was the strongly fortified city of Eryx. The city possessed some of the best natural defenses. It was located roughly 750 meters, 2,460 feet above sea level, being one of the highest points in Sicily. This made it one of the most naturally defensible cities in the ancient world. To the north, the city was positioned upon a cliff, making an approach impossible. To the west and eastern side, the terrain was passable and had several narrow paths leading along them, but the terrain remained steep and rocky, and the paths were narrow and winding, making it difficult to maneuver any sizable force along them. The best option to Pyrrhus would be the southern approach. The hill was still steep and rocky, but was the flattest of the four, housing the best paths in the city's main gate. Another problem Pyrrhus had to face was the fact the rocky terrain made the use of any siege engines impossible. Pyrrhus would have to rely solely on his infantry to scale the wall with ladders. To make matters more difficult, every day Pyrrhus waited, his enemies grew stronger. The Carthaginians further reinforced Lilybaeum, and in Italy, every day he was in Sicily, the Romans made gains against his Italian allies. For Pyrrhus, the time was now or never. As the sun rose on a warm summer day in 278 BC, Pyrrhus's troops would be aligned for battle. His elite Epirot phalangites, numbering roughly 6,000 to 8,000, would make up the bulk of his main attack force. They would be supported on their flanks by several detachments of lighter armored Sicilian hoplites. In front of his main line, he positioned a contingent of mercenary infantry. Further down the slope, he positioned his 1,500 Cretan archers, which had much better range and were able to fire upon the walls from a distance. In front of his line, he positioned his 2,000 slingers and javelin men to harass the defenders and soften the enemy resistance. Finally, at the base of the mountain, he positioned his 2,000 cavalry and 19 elephants to deter any Carthaginian counterattack. Within the city itself, the main Carthaginian force would have been made up of roughly 3,000 heavy infantry. They served as a professional corps of the garrison and were equipped similarly to the Greek hoplites, with spears and large round shields. There was also an equal number of Greek and Iberian mercenaries, positioned at key points along the walls and within the city itself. Intermixed along the walls was roughly 2,000 Numidian slingers, archers, and javelin men. They also positioned several thousand Libyan and Numidian light infantry outside of the walls to harass and disrupt the Epirots as they advanced up the hill. As Pyrrhus's army began advancing up the slope, the light infantry would begin to skirmish, exchanging javelins, arrows, and rocks. The mercenary infantry, which was both lighter armored and fought in a much looser formation, was able to traverse the terrain better and now launched an attack on the Numidian and Libyan light infantry that was positioned outside of the walls. After a brief exchange, the majority of the light infantry would withdraw back within the fortified walls. As Pyrrhus's elite phalangites now reached the walls, they would begin setting up their scaling ladders. As the first Pyrrhic troops began topping the wall, it proved a difficult fight. Since they could not use any siege towers or battering rams, the troops were forced to climb the wall single file. Though eventually, the Pyrrhic troops were able to establish a bridgehead upon the wall, with Pyrrhus being one of the first men to ascend it. Quickly, the Carthaginian forces were overwhelmed as they began being pushed off the wall, and many retreated within the city to fight on its narrow and winding streets, which posed as an excellent defensive position. As the Pyrrhic troops gained control of the majority of the wall and the gatehouse, they were able to let in the rest of their army. What now divulged was a mass close-quarters street fight. Altogether, the battle would last the entire day, and by the time the sun began to set, the Epirots were in control of the majority of the city. There were still a few pockets of resistance, but for the most part, his enemy was dead. Several mercenary contingents had surrendered and were compelled into Pyrrhus's army, while the majority of the Carthaginians were killed. The victory for Pyrrhus was decisive. as he captured one of the two major Carthaginian strongholds in western Sicily. Hearing the news, the majority of the Carthaginian cities along the northern coast now willingly surrendered to him, though Pyrrhus's army had lost several thousand men in the assault, and his number of elite Epirot phalangites continued to dwindle. In the western part of the island, the Mamertines controlled the port city of Messina, and since Pyrrhus's arrival, had begun to cooperate with the Carthaginians to carry out raids across Sicily, both hampering his supply lines and causing vast destruction. Before he could begin the logistically intensive task of besieging Lilybaeum, he had to march back to deal with the raiders. He would meet the Mamertine army near the Patri River in northeastern Sicily. The Mamertine force was decisively defeated and forced to retreat back within Messina. Pyrrhus now aimed to capture the last major Carthaginian stronghold on the island, the port city of Lilybaeum. The Carthaginians, realizing the importance of Lilybaeum as their last stronghold on Sicily, had heavily fortified it and brought up the majority of their fleet to make sure the Epirites could not fully blockade it. As Pyrrhus began besieging the fortress, he soon realized the difficulty he was going to experience, and instead favored to resolve his problem diplomatically. He initially aimed to offer the Carthaginians a status quo peace, allowing them to keep Lilybaeum, but this was met with harsh resistance from his Sicilian allies, who wanted them fully expelled from the island. Listening to his allies, Pyrrhus instead offered Carthage peace only if they agreed to completely withdraw from Sicily and cede control of Lilybaeum to him. The Carthaginians greatly opposed surrendering Lilybaeum and quickly rejected Pyrrhus's terms. They knew as long as they possessed mastery of the sea, Lilybaeum was virtually impregnable. Pyrrhus, also realizing this, began demanding his Sicilian allies help him pay to construct a larger fleet. The Sicilians, however, denied his requests, forcing Pyrrhus to begin implementing compulsory payment and station large garrisons in the cities. This greatly upset the Sicilians and began alienating them to his cause. The Sicilians had initially welcomed Pyrrhus as a liberator, but their enthusiasm had waned, and now with the financial support, levies, garrisons, and strict military control over their cities, many that had previously sided with him now turned against him. Pyrrhus was still bogged down at Lilybaeum and making no progress. His financial situation was also a disaster, and with no support from the Sicilian cities, he could no longer pay his troops. With the situation quickly unraveling, Pyrrhus made the decision to abandon the island. He lifted his siege of Lilybaeum and gathered his forces at Catania, before setting sail back to Italy in 276 BC. As Pyrrhus's force left the harbor, he was about to find himself in the midst of two enemy forces. A large Carthaginian naval force was anchored in the strait awaiting an ambush, and secondly, a Mamertine army of roughly 10,000 men had crossed and were waiting to ambush him near Locri. Pyrrhus was completely oblivious to this threat and had not anticipated any contest in his crossing, though as the Carthaginian ships came into view, he quickly aimed to make a dash to the allied Bruttian city of Locri. Although Pyrrhus's ship remained unharmed, the Carthaginians managed to catch a sizable portion of his navy, sinking a number and damaging up to 30. With his naval position severely weakened, and what remained being blockaded inside of Locri, Pyrrhus was now forced to march his army along the coast to Tarentum. Though unknown to him, he was playing right into the hands of his enemy. The Mamertines were afraid to face Pyrrhus in the open field, after their decisive defeat in the previous year. But this time they wouldn't have to. The path consisted of river crossings, narrow passes, steep valleys, and thick forests, making a guerrilla war greatly favorable to the attackers. As Pyrrhus's army began moving north, they came under an almost constant barrage of arrows and javelins. The large army found it difficult to maneuver the terrain by itself, and with the constant harassment, the army's movement slowed to a crawl. In several points where the terrain was advantageous, the Mamertines launched small-scale attacks, further disrupting the army's order and dissolving portions into confusion and disarray. In one of these attacks, the Mamertines managed to mortally wound 2 of Pyrrhus's elephants, and managed to isolate and destroy part of his rear guard. Pyrrhus, trying to ward off attacks, began riding up and down his line, trying to stabilize and reform his men. Several times he became engaged in fights with Mamertine soldiers, and eventually one of them succeeded in knocking him from his horse and cutting his head, forcing Pyrrhus to withdraw back into the formation. As he was doing this, the Mamertines began preparing for another attack. One of them, a huge towering warrior, ran forth, far in advance of the rest, and in a bold voice challenged Pyrrhus to come out, that is, if he was still alive. This greatly angered Pyrrhus, and he quickly wheeled around. Full of wrath and smeared with blood, he charged the barbarian. Before the man could move to defend himself, Pyrrhus struck him with his sword. He was moving at such a speed and with such anger in his swing that he decapitated the man instantly. This happening right in front of the main Mamertine host terrified them, checking them from any further advance. They were amazed and confounded at Pyrrhus, and at once thought of him as a god. The terror he inflicted on the majority of the Mamertines allowed him to continue the rest of his march to Tarentum mostly unimpeded. By the time he reached the city, his army numbered around 20,000 foot and 3,000 horse, as well as about 20 elephants. While Pyrrhus had been in Sicily, the Romans had made gains against his Italian allies. Many of the cities which had revolted after Rome's defeat at Asculum had been recaptured. Furthermore, Rome had heavily fortified and garrisoned many of the border forts, making any further northern incursions difficult. By 275 BC, the Romans had mobilized both of the consular armies to fight Pyrrhus. They had also replaced their consuls, with Lucius Cornelius Caudinus in control of the southern army, which was positioned in Lucania, and Manius Curius Dentatus, who was stationed in Samnium, near the Roman city of Beneventum. Once Pyrrhus heard of the Roman army's positioning, he decided it best to try and defeat the Romans before they could unify. Pyrrhus's force was severely weakened from the multitude of long years campaigning. His Epirot contingent had grown increasingly thin, as he received less and less fresh replacements from Epirus. He figured if he could defeat the Romans in detail, it would be his best chance of victory. If the Romans were able to unify like they had at Asculum, his force would be decisively outmatched. He sent a small detachment to try and delay the southern force, while the main force marched to Beneventum. Pyrrhus's army encamped on the opposite side of a plain, across from Beneventum in the Roman camp. Pyrrhus knew that another frontal attack on the Romans would be costly, and whether he won or lost, it would most likely break the back of his army. He instead devised a plan to lead his best contingent through the woods to the south, where his army would be hidden from view, before attacking the Romans in the rear and launching his main force across the field. He had seen the strategy of attacking at dawn used to perfection. Seleucus had used it at the battles of the Tigris and Adib, where he had managed to move his army under the cover of darkness and suddenly appear at dawn to find his enemy disoriented and unprepared. As night fell, Pyrrhus formed up the majority of his men into battle line, where they were to await the trumpet to signal their attack. Pyrrhus's best troops, including many of his Epirates and best elephants, moved through the woods. They were led by several Samnite scouts who knew the terrain. Though with the darkness, moving that large of a force through the dense forest proved a challenge. The path they attempted to follow was rough and covered in many points, which made maneuvering the large war elephants slow and difficult work, causing a large part of Pyrrhus's troops to get disconnected from the Samnite scouts. Already taking longer than expected, many of the torches now began to burn out, causing the already lost troops to be left without light. By the time dawn broke on the horizon, only a small portion of Pyrrhus's troops had arrived out of the woods. As they waited for the rest of the contingent, they were in full view of the Romans. Dentatus, soon realizing the Epirates' plan, quickly began mustering his army and descended down the slope upon the Epirates. In the confusion, Pyrrhus's main contingent still had not been signaled, and unable to see what was transpiring at the other end of the field, remained in formation next to their camp. Although more stragglers were still arriving from the forest, the Epirate troops were greatly outnumbered, and the broken ground made it harder for them to effectively use their phalanx and elephants. Eventually being driven back into the mouth of the woods, they were forced to abandon the attack and retreated back toward their camp. The Romans, not pursuing their enemy, instead aimed to fall on Pyrrhus's main contingent, which was made up mostly of Tarentines, Lucanians, and Bruttians, with cavalry on the wings and several elephants in reserve. As the two armies began to engage, Pyrrhus's defeated contingent returned to help. The number of elephants was now greatly bolstered, and although the Roman infantry made several decisive breakthroughs, they were unable to stop the elephants breaking through their own lines. With the Romans lacking any reserves, they were at once forced to retreat back to their camp. With the time now reaching around noon, the main Roman force was prepared and fully formed up for battle. With the return of their commander, they now planned on a second attack on the Epirates. Pyrrhus had reshuffled his army, placing his Epirates on the right and integrating the elephants into his front line to try and discourage any further Roman attacks. Though as the Romans topped the hill, they remained relentless. As the skirmishers began to engage, the fresh Roman light infantry began peppering the Pyrrhic troops with javelins and arrows. As the elephants began taking the brunt of this beating, they began to panic, moving back and forth and disorganizing their line. Before long, the beasts began to bolt, turning around and running back through their own infantry, trampling hundreds of their own men. With their ranks now broken and a fresh, determined enemy marching against them, the rest of Pyrrhus's army soon followed suit. The Pyrrhic army immediately retreated back to Tarentum, from where Pyrrhus, after garrisoning the city, set sail for Epirus. as he would never return to Italy. For the Romans, the victory was final. Pyrrhus was unable to sustain the replacements the Romans could, and with his abandonment of Italy, the southern tribes would all surrender to Rome. Tarentum would solely remain in defiance up until Pyrrhus's death in 272 BC, at which, after hearing the news, would surrender to the Romans. Pyrrhus would go on to recapture most of Macedonia and lead an invasion against Sparta, where, with the help of his rival Antigonus, he would be killed. The Pyrrhic Wars would prove a great war of expansion, as Rome would secure firm control of southern Italy, and the Carthaginians would soon come to be masters of Sicily. As Pyrrhus had properly predicted, the island would soon become the focal point of a series of wars between the superpowers, which would bring both to their knees and give rise to some of history's greatest generals.